All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, land of plaid and coffee, and PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and real quick, before we get on to, that's right, today's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. Real quick shout out, and you guys can jump over there. It's called squatchcoffee.com, squatchcoffee.com, the Sasquatch Coffee Company. My good friend Gunnar over there. Gunnar, keep those beans a-roasting and keep them getting packed and getting them out here to all of us. Absolutely love it. As a matter of fact, if you guys want to know, my favorite blends are both Skookum for a really dark roast, and actually the other one is kind of a medium roast, but it's really good. It's called Eyeshine. I really dig Eyeshine. So Eyeshine and Skookum. There you go. As a matter of fact, let's get in now to today's Bigfoot encounter story. The Fall of Bigfoot. It was there amongst the trees. It swayed, staring in my direction for what seemed an eternity. Then, and very quietly, it turned slowly and disappeared. Fall was here, and so was Bigfoot. I never believed that such things existed. I mean, things like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, if that is your choice of names for these creatures. But for nearly 3 consecutive falls, I'd seen one, heard it, and, well, talked to it. I guess you'd describe it to be Bigfoot season. I woke up early. It was the first autumn in a new home just outside of Alger, Washington, between the actual town of Alger and Lake Samish. Talk about beautiful. I still hike up Alger Alp Trail at least once a week, or head out on a crisp, cold, early October morning to fish the lake, or fly fish a creek or two here and there. That is, however, when I'm not in my shop creating bowls, and mugs, and pottery of all kinds for my current customers and new ones alike. I am a ceramist by trade, and very passionate, you'd say, about the whole art. But as I said, it was fall in the new house. I woke up before the sun had even had a chance to greet the world that day, let alone me. I poured a cup of my favorite blend of coffee, made sure the wife was still asleep, dressed, and headed out to the shop to get started on a new set of pieces I was working on for a customer. Although the light of morning was unavailable, I could still see the yellowing of some big leaf oak and the beautiful red of the alders around my yard due to a street light that stood towering over the shop. It was fall, and the leaves were turning, and the pine cones were falling. I was turning too, literally around suddenly, and found myself staring into the trees. It was as if something in the back of my mind suddenly said, "Did you see that?" While the rest of you simply goes on as if nothing happened or was there to catch your attention in the first place. No answer given. But I found myself a split second later answering the voice in my head by turning to the side and looking back into the forest that literally backed my property. I could hardly see a thing, let alone anything to be worried about or thrilled about. It was still too dark as the tree line was just outside the reach of the street lamp light. Shrugging, I walked into the shop before my coffee got cold and got to work. Pranksters. Days passed, leaves began to fall like rain instead of the few here and there, and it began to rain more often as well, especially in the wee hours of the morning. But by the time I downed a cup of coffee and went to get my refill and head to the shop, the rain usually ceased, at least for a little while. Fall in the Pacific Northwest was in full bloom, and let me add this little fact. The autumn season here can literally rival that of those oh-so-famous northeasterly states, if you want to know the truth. The cold, too, had come with the rain, and so did a prankster, or pranksters, plural. So we thought. The first night, my wife swore she'd seen a shadow of a person walk in quickly from one side of my shop to the other. I stepped outside for a few, snooped around a bit, but no sound or evidence proved there was anyone around, save me. Again, the next night, as she washed dishes, she fervently motioned me over and asked me to stand beside her and look out the kitchen window for a moment. To much of my own surprise, and my heart really started to race at that moment, I could see a massive but wispy-like shadow myself darting in and out of the tree line. It moved over behind the shop, and with that I found myself a bit worried. It was a burglar or some prankster kid out there, and one who might do something to my shop, my work. I couldn't have that happen, especially when I had a whole set of pottery ready for a client. To have it broken, smashed, or stolen, well, I'd have none of that. I headed outside with my 30-30 hunting rifle in hand, with my wife whispering loudly to me, "Be safe and don't kill anyone, Charlie." Of course, I was not planning on shooting anyone, and I kept the bullets, 3 of them in fact, on my dresser top, so I could slip them into my pocket quickly. Easy to get to they were, but I never loaded the thing unless I really planned on using it. I ran out the back door and made noise purposefully and saying without yelling too loud that I have a gun. I phrased it matter-of-factly. I reached the halfway point between the house and the shop, and that is when I heard loud tapping on the kitchen window. I turned and saw my wife mouthing frantically words I could not make out, but she was pointing to the west side of the shop. I stepped out of the light, and just to get a better view, beyond its reaches. And boy, did I. It stood there, just inside the shadows of trees in the shop, but its massive shadow could not stop the ambient light of the moon shining down upon it. It swayed, then stopped, then swayed again. You could tell it was tall, as its head was barely a foot below the eave of the corner of the shop. That shop, at its lowest point, was 9.5 feet off the ground. Like the morning mist I'd been used to for years, simply vanishing away, the massive shadow simply moved back into the dark and vanished itself. My wife swore it was pranksters. Even after my description of it, she seemed to have none of that mythical beast in the forest or real things as I described it. But I let her believe what she wanted. However, I knew that was no person, and I was to learn that fact to become even more of a fact not a week later. Hello, Harry. Many stories, reports, and tales of these things seem so violent in nature. And maybe it's because they are wild. Maybe it is a fact they cannot be trusted and should be avoided, if at all possible. But while I think they can all be these things once in a while, I think you come into contact with one or a few like this. Just so you know, I would never trust it, and I can see that they are wild, and what kind of damage they could do if they wanted. But there is another side to them, and I say them because there was more than one. But there is another side of them that is, well, curious and highly intelligent. The pottery order I delivered a few days later, and new orders were coming in that week, so many so that I had to start pushing out deliveries into the first 2 weeks of November. Business was good, and so were my new neighbors. Friday morning, I was it was just truly a picturesque Pacific Northwest morning. The leaves still turning gold and some red and even a few dark brown and purple. Contrary to popular belief, many of the trees in the region are not just coniferous. There is plenty of deciduous trees here too. The mist and low fog floated through the trees, and here and there the sunlight would finally make a break through the fog for a second, only to disappear again, but not before it gave away its secret. There it was, standing between the trees, west of the shop, a Bigfoot. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I thought about yelling for my wife, but she was gone into town for some shopping and breakfast with some ladies we'd met at our new church. Knowing I was on my own and without someone to warn me, apparently, I can be pretty rash and stupid with my actions, I suppose. I ventured out slowly into the backyard, heading towards the shop as if I'd seen nothing. Basically, I wanted to pretend it was just another morning and I was off to work. All the while, however, as I took each sip of coffee, I would tilt my head back just enough to see it standing there, or if it was still standing there, and it was. I finally made it to the shop, but instead of going in, I decided to finish that cup of coffee outside. I was curious like it, I suppose. And while that voice in my head, that sounded much like my wife, was yelling at me to get a gun and get back inside, there was another small and quiet voice telling me to stay. The one I believed I'd heard over and over every day, especially when I was reading my Bible. The voice said to stay. Then it said to look up, and now. The mist and fog were thick, but this thing was so massive, and its orangish-brown color stood out amongst the trees and shrubs. And while I could not see its face too well, I could see that suddenly we had some kind of eye contact happening. It was all of just over 8 feet tall at least. Its head was almost sat on its shoulders, but there was some neck. Not much of any, but there was some. Its whole body was covered in thick, long hair, as if autumn itself painted the color of this thing. I could see it had a chin, but the mouth, well, I could not see much of one. But I did notice the eyes, or the sockets around him. They were deep and dark. It had the shape of a person, I suppose, but those arms, wow! They were muscular, long, and the hand resting against the tree next to it was massive too. It started swaying, and even bent at the waist for a moment. I thought just briefly, though, that it was getting ready to attack me. But a split second later, it stood erect. No hunch. Straight up, just as an arrow, as it continued staring at me, and I at it. Then the fog became thicker and thicker, this like soup simmering as you add more to it to thicken it up. And then, just like that, I believed it was a male for some reason, had disappeared again. Click, click, jabber, jabber. My wife knew I was telling the truth, and Lord forgive me, but she asked if my gun was with me, and I told her yes. My bad for lying, Lord. But eventually she would come to see and understand what I understood. This Bigfoot, and those with it, its family, I suppose, were not a threat unless provoked, I believe, as any wild animal would be. As a matter of fact, I think I came into contact with the one or few out of a million, the curious kind. After the staring contest, it started communicating, I guess you'd call it, with me. It started out one morning after I had finished a few mugs of coffee I was making. I thought it was my machine, what we call a potter's wheel at first. Then I thought it was the kiln. But I soon realized it was coming from the trees outside through the window I had cracked open. I stepped outside, and the click, click, click came from the trees. In threes, from the trees. I paused, and then again, click, 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 could be heard. I walked towards the sound, which was somewhat of a mistake, because suddenly it was like a growl, which, with such a vibrating pulse, it seemed to go right through you. I shuddered, stopped, and moved back a few steps. Then again came the click, click, click sound. Apparently, he was there, just inside the trees where I could not see him. But apparently he did not wish to be seen that day or approached. By Thanksgiving, well, the clicking turned to jabber is what I would call it. It sounded like words, but a jibber-jabber to you and me, I guess. Once in a while, when heading out in the morning, I would make the clicking sound, only to have it repeated back to me seconds later. That is how I knew he was there watching me. Yes, it was all a bit unnerving, but I have to say I found myself thrilled at the same time. And while most of the Bigfoot researchers or hunters would think of me as nuts, but for some reason I did not have a fear of this thing, as long as I kept my distance, that is. Here and there came a warning when I stepped outside to head to the shop in the wee dark hours of those mornings. With that warning, I would stop, wait a moment, and then make a click sound. Once repeated back to me, I would head to the shop. So yes, I was nervous at times, and my wife would finally see it herself, and yet found herself as full of wonderment and awe as I was. But first, I have to tell you the exchange she had. Well, her first one. She too woke up early at my behest, of course. I fed her some coffee to wake her up, but she was on full alert, that was for sure. We stepped outside and made it to the front door of the shop when we both heard it, some gibberish from way back in the woods. She made a clicking sound, a couple of them, and yes, again at my nudging, but she gave me that look and did it anyway. A return click came, and she found herself, well, a bit more relaxed, but still nervous. The gibberish continued for a few minutes, then she returned to the house and I to my shop, both of us full of that wonderment. Days and weeks passed, the sounds and vocalizations continued. Then it was near Christmas. The snow was falling as it did that time of the year, something we were used to being from the Northeast originally. But the snow began to fall, and that day I saw him again, standing there amongst the pine and shrub. He looked at me, clicked, and then out of nowhere, well, actually from the woods to my right, came a return click. That was not far from where my wife was looking through a window. I put up 2 fingers to alert her. There were now 2 of them. Again, some gibberish was heard, and this time from all around me. Well, us. It was like 3 or 4 voices, or more perhaps, talking to each other. As I turned back, he was walking off into the woods. They were gone. And I learned that fact by walking into the woods and without a growl to stop me. I knew they were gone, at least for now. I felt like I should say goodbye, but I knew they would be back again, hopefully, someday. I found myself Christmas Eve day 200 to 300 yards up a trail from my house. I also found tree breaks and something that looked like a huge dome-like structure, but mangled, like it was torn apart. But winter came and no Bigfoot. Spring came, and still no Bigfoot. Summer came, and again, no Bigfoot. 2 years later. I wonder to this day where they go when they leave. Do they have a second home? Do they migrate? Do they just slip a bit deeper into the woods away from people? People even as welcoming as us? But it was late September, a year later after everything happened. There was a crispness that morning that filled my lungs the moment I stepped out into it and headed to my shop. And that is when I saw it. It was there, amongst the trees. It swayed, staring in my direction for what seemed an eternity. Then, and very quietly, it turned and slowly disappeared back into the trees. Fall was here, and so was Bigfoot. Charlie and Meg.